Last summer, I did a podcast series with Kirk Bowman on value pricing, and software development. Recently, I had a question about that podcast come up. Michael Seidel wrote, "How and when do you recommend charging for a value conversation like in a paid discovery phase?" And he went on to say, "I'm afraid that in the beginning, with little practice, conversations digging for the value will lead to repeated long meetings and potentially a big loss of time and money on his part." And he also went on to say that qualification of prospects is probably a key factor, but he still feels that discovering the value brings a lot of value in itself for the prospect. And so he's wondering about when does it make sense to have a paid discovery phase, if you will. I think before I discuss that, though, the first thing to realize is just that a value conversation itself, even without a lot of practice, doesn't have to be a lengthy conversation. When you go to the doctor and the doctor's diagnosing what's wrong with you to try and help make you better, the doctor will do that in 5-10 minutes, probably in most cases, and probably within a half an hour. Now, the doctor may decide that it makes sense to do further testing, but the doctor also may just prescribe a treatment for you. So I think it's important to use intuition when you have those first conversations and when you have a value conversation, when you start out a value conversation. Use your intuition along the way to decide if it makes sense to prescribe a potential project that you're going to work with, that you're going to partner with your customer on, or if it makes more sense to have some type of a paid discovery phase up front. For example, if the outcome, the objectives, the expectations, what success looks like, even the background of where things are now, if those are not very clear, if those aren't articulated very well, then that may be a sign that a paid discovery phase makes sense. Another thing that's important is just realize in a value conversation, you're taking a risk yourself. You're investing in being effective and doing the right thing and not just getting started doing it the most efficient way possible. And because you're making an investment, I would have to say you shouldn't worry about counting the time and worry about the time and the money. Don't worry about those things. Instead, watch for red flags that you're not making a wise investment yourself. Know when you should walk away from a project or say not now. For example, if you're dealing with somebody who's clearly not the buyer, if they can't approve of and shake hands over the project and get started, then that's a red flag that you need to have a conversation with somebody else. If the person you're talking with is obsessed with how things will be done, not why, in other words, they're the type of person that seems like they'll micromanage a lot of things, that may be a red flag. If the budget for the project just seems ridiculous, for example, if you can perceive at least $10,000 or $20,000 worth of cost on your part, and for whatever reason the budget's like $2,000, obviously there's a huge mismatch there. Now you may proceed to see if there's some way you can do it for a fraction of that, but if you know that your costs are always such that you could never do it for less than 5, if the budget's 2, there's no way for you to approach that project. Maybe another red flag to watch out for is somebody who obsesses over the price. Do they keep asking, what is this going to cost? What is this going to cost? Is it what they lead with? Now you can steer the conversation away from that, but if that's all the conversation ever entails, then that may be a red flag too. So watch for when you're not making a wise investment yourself. Otherwise, if everything's green, if all the indicators come back okay, keep proceeding with the value conversation. It shouldn't take more than half an hour, or maybe a couple of hours at most to discuss the value of things, and realize you're making an investment in being effective. You're not going to be efficient about this. Don't worry about it being efficient in a value conversation. Like you said, a value conversation, though, does provide significant value. That's something you're providing upfront to a customer that could be worth a lot to them. That will help build trust in a relationship. So don't worry about it if you're just going to dive into the first project. Don't worry about the value you're giving away in a value conversation. That's fine. Even if the project doesn't happen, it's just a little bit of value you're giving away. It may be significantly important to the customer, but it's kind of like a good faith, if you will. Don't worry so much about that, though. However, if it's going to take a lot to understand what the wise course of action is, then it may make sense to have a paid discovery process. The important thing to realize there, though, is that discovery is like a project itself, and it has to be valuable to the customer. If it's not valuable to the customer, in other words, the outcome of that isn't worthwhile for them, then it doesn't make sense to happen. So make sure that it's it's valuable to the customer, and that's the mentality you bring to the table. It can't just be valuable to you as a provider. It needs to be valuable to them so that they can justify paying you to do it. Now, some things that may provide some value, if the background of the current situation isn't well understood. Where things are now, how they got to where they are now, why they are that way. If that's not well understood, that may make sense to do, or that would be some value you could provide in a discovery phase. Surveying customers or employees and understanding the state of the organization and the service they provide to customers, what people are happy about, what people aren't happy about, that can be immensely valuable as well. Understanding value is itself important too. So just quantifying and qualifying the value is something that you can provide in a discovery phase. Understanding that helps your customer justify what they're doing. It also helps you and your customer get other people to buy into what's going to take place. So if people are hesitant, you can understand why the project would be helpful to them, why it would be valuable to them, and you can get them on board by just playing into their self-interest. By discussing the value, you can amplify it. So you may have been able to achieve like 1x. Well, by discussing the value, maybe you can hit 1.5x the value. So you can amplify or maximize the value out of the project. And of course, just discussing value is a conversation about how to be effective. And how to be effective, understanding that is extremely valuable to customers. Another thing that you can provide in a discovery phase that can be valuable is just understanding what I like to refer to as islands of value. If a customer comes to you with a project that's rather substantial, that you could see 2 years of duration to accomplish, you may want to find 4 intermediate points, and I call them islands of value. There's something special about them. They're not phases. It's not we're going to do this, this, and this, and then in 2 years you'll start reaping value. It's we're going to go to this island first, this first island, and it's going to start providing value to the customer. And then we're going to go to this island, and it'll provide even more value. And you have a series of investments that you're trying to outline. That can happen in a discovery phase as well. Now, you're not going to like commit to those outcomes at the end of a discovery phase, but you have a rough idea of what those 4 islands or 6 islands look like, those 6 potential targets. And so you have a plan potentially to look at going forward. Now, it may change in a year, but at least for that first project, you can carve out an island that should be substantially valuable and worthwhile to go to. In the process of talking about a discovery phase, so if you for some reason think that that's necessary, make sure that your customer understands why it's valuable first. So make sure that you're not just proposing this and asking them to have faith in you. But the first conversation, if it isn't about doing an actual project, if it's doing a discovery project, then they should be able to understand some point during that conversation why discovery could be beneficial. Now you can give them some of these examples I've talked about how it could be valuable. You can talk about past discovery you've done with other customers and what was valuable to them. But you have to at some point stop then, once your customer understands why this can be valuable, and ask them to start talking about why it would be valuable to them. Make them restate the things that you've stated that seems important to them. By them restating it and explaining how it would be valuable to them means that you've hit on the right potential areas to focus on in a discovery phase. Ask them how it can even be more valuable. So ask them for things that you didn't even bring up, you haven't even discussed with them yet. You'd be surprised what they'll come up with. And then that's something that's clearly valuable to them because it's an idea that came from them. So give them the opportunity to re-articulate why it's valuable to them. And then make sure that that's worthwhile. So you have to take all of what they basically say would be valuable in the discovery phase and go back and figure out if you can do that in a discovery phase. Figure out how you would price that such that it would be worthwhile to the customer to do that discovery phase. With the understanding that it's very possible at the end of the discovery phase that you may help the customer understand that this is a project that they shouldn't go forward with, or not now anyways. So those are possible outcomes as well. It's just realizing that the project may not be worthwhile to go forward with. One trade-off I'd like to point out, if you do decide to go with a discovery project upfront, is just consider that in the process of providing all this value, you are reducing risk and uncertainty in discovering what's valuable and discovering what could be done. So you are providing value, yes, hopefully, right? That's why we would do this. But that also means that when you go to do the next project, that the value you're going to create there isn't as substantial as if you had lumped together discovery and the first project. So you shouldn't expect to probably charge as much. You shouldn't expect as much of a fair share, if you will, of the value that's created, because you've reduced your own risk in the process. You've certainly reduced your customers as well, and they paid you for that, but you also reduced your own risk in a discovery phase. And that may be a worthwhile trade-off to make for a smaller share of the value you create. In other words, a smaller fee for the first project. But just realize that's a decision you're making when you do this. So if the value is substantial, the outcomes, the objectives, expectations are clear, and success seems well defined, then I say don't do a discovery phase. Take the risk with your customer. However, if the value isn't substantial, or perhaps if you're working with a new customer, then smaller risks may be more reasonable. In the case of a new customer, it may make sense to start with a discovery phase because you haven't worked together. Now, I always recommend trying to build trust and relationships, but building trust and relationships through conversation alone up front only goes so far. Until you've actually had a successful project under your belt, you won't have the same level of trust and that same type of relationship with that customer. So you may with a new customer decide that discovery is a good approach to take, just to see how you work together, if you will, and if you can work together well. However, if you have an existing customer and you have good trust, you've had successful projects in the past, you both trust each other, you have a good relationship, then I'd encourage you to just take the bigger risk, right? So if you've done things successfully before, why wouldn't you be successful together going forward? Take a bigger risk, understand the value, focus on the value, and don't worry about a paid discovery phase. And maybe one last alternative is kind of mishmash of the two. If you do have a new customer or a situation where the value isn't as significant, find that smaller island first. So don't tackle everything, but find a smaller island and do that in lieu of just a discovery phase. So the discovery will be embedded in a smaller project that does also entail producing something of value as well beyond just the discovery. You could do that as kind of a mishmash of the two approaches. And that would give you a smaller risk to take without just doing a standalone discovery phase. I hope that helps you understand some of the potential trade-offs you would want to make in terms of whether or not you do a paid discovery phase. And again, focus on what's valuable, and I think you'll have a clear understanding of the right approach to take.